let's get on to what I'd call the Wikipedia debate. Can we really believe the stuff that people put out there that comes from their own minds? The expert versus the user. Expert content, user-generated content. In what situations does user-generated content work well? Charles, do you want to pick up on that for 60 seconds?
Well, first of all, they needn't be mutually exclusive. We trust often the cloud, especially when there are a lot of users who we know. I think user-generated content works well where you are clear about your own objectives. Trusted advisor works well where it's more formal, more organized. You're being directed from above, if you like. So things like policy, compliance, how to sell a product, knowing the facts about a product, specific policies around customer service, those things probably need more of a trusted advisor. One last point. User-generated content requires skills of the learner that we underestimate sometimes. One is the ability to research. Second is critical evaluation skills.
Yes.
And that's because there is a need for self-validation, and that's not to say that user-generated content doesn't provide that, but it needs to be a community of people big enough and sensible enough to be able to come up with the right quality of learning.
Is there also a point, if I can just pick up on that last point, does the community also need to be large enough to ensure that there is a critical field surrounding the person so they feel there's a risk if they get it wrong and therefore they're required to self-evaluate?
Yes, I mean, if I look at my daughter on Facebook and her community of 450 friends that she's got, I'd be mortified to think that she was taking their advice on how to get through a GCSE exam paper. However, no doubt she'll find some useful tips and things that she'll be able to use.
Because it's big enough, yeah. Stato, what's the data?
Well, we asked organisations how many of you are actually facilitating and enabling the sharing of user-generated content, and it came down a really, really low 16%.
Wow.
Actually, there are a huge range of technologies that they're using without identifying it as user-generated content. So we've got 34% offering blogs or wikis, which after all are a form of user-generated content. And sharing of video content too has become much more prevalent, and now over 60% of organisations are sharing best practice videos of one sort or another. So they may not actually label it as content or user-generated, but actually they're doing it, and it is increasing fast. A lot of organisations are saying they're going to increase.
It's almost as if the question reveals how limited our own thinking is, that we refuse to see the stuff that people are doing as useful content. It's things they do, but it's nothing to do with learning, which is a tragedy. We should be including that in the learning mix. Charles, Rose, what's your take on this?
I completely agree about the need for people to develop critical awareness skills to take the best advantage of user-generated content. That's absolutely true. But at the other end of the spectrum, it's about supporting people to make that content in the most valuable way. So there's a kind of a critical analysis piece at either end, both in the creation and in the appreciation.
Good point. And Kenny, do you use this at Sky at all?
We do in the form of blogs and things. I think there's less in terms of user-generated content across the general population. And I think it's difficult in a corporate organisation when there's a huge element of risk associated with it to make sure that you have the correct moderation in place to ensure that you protect your brand. Yeah,
there is always, not always, very often there's a corporate resistance to the idea of this. How do you get your managers and executives to feel comfortable with that?
I think we've done it over a long time and looked at, we've been involved in e-learning and learning technology for 5 or 6 years, and it's been an evolution. And sometimes, it takes one of your execs, one of your senior leaders to buy in and support, and very quickly you find a cascade and a snowball effect across the rest of the areas. Yeah, and I think that's so true. Once you get a success in one place, if you can back it up and show the worth, and the person there, the executive, has conversations with other people in their own language and business speak, where suddenly the whole thing's making sense. Okay, let's have a question for everybody here about this. Now, this is a slightly different question. You'll have to read it carefully. Firstly, grab your handsets in a furore of activity. And then I'd like to
choose up to 3 of these answers. In what situations does user-generated content work well? Let's find out what the answer is. Five is indeed the winner, but 2 comes out well. All right, so for the benefit of the panel, I'll just read out who the 2 go-ahead winners were. Problem-solving and complex projects, where sharing information between lots of people will help people get what you were talking about, Charles, that richness of information. And then number 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is the dispersed team, yeah, with common interests. Absolutely makes sense that if you have people spread out, they'd get benefit from that. Quality as a priority is fascinating, that should be answered. And I don't think many people would see that, but I'm pleased that some people have. Does anybody have any comment made on this? You were very strong. You came out straight away saying, yes, it's 5. Why was 5 the answer you jumped on?
Because you need something.
Yep.
I mean, many of the other things there is sort of working all terms of differences.
Yep. I'll repeat this back to audience. If you don't have the cloud with 5, what do you do? You're stuck because you've had a dispersed audience. I'll tell you what the problem with 5 is from most organisational points of view is, people don't know it's missing. We've never had it, but because John works in Scotland and Billy works in Wales, well, yeah, that's the way it is. So they email or whatever. Why would this new thing make any difference? And then, as Kenny says, once somebody puts it in place and shows it, wow, then people start sitting up. But you're absolutely right. Of course people need it. The problem is the perception that, well, we don't know we need it because it's something new. Panel, any thoughts about this results from the audience?
I've got a thought. I think it's really heartening to see this business of, yes, distributed teams or dispersed teams, but this notion of complex problems and complex problem solving, because just to give you another distributed, that plays into distributed intelligence and distributed skills. So your team with different skills is brought together effectively across geographical distance to solve a complex problem.
And in fact, a very, very, very small example, the presentations upstairs have all been collected by my assistant Trent Rosen, who has done this from Australia. He's in Sydney, I'm in London, and we've got people all over the UK getting things ready for the conference. We don't even think about it, we just naturally use distributed systems, so you're right. Any other thoughts, Charles, Kenny?
No, the only one I'm slightly surprised at is employee engagement. And I wonder what's behind that. I guess it's because if it's provided by your employer, then you're engaged with the ability that to access lots of resources, and that may make you feel better about where you work. That's a possibility. But on the whole, there is I suppose, an important distinction between learning that is needed by an organisation and learning that comes more intrinsically from an individual. And the extreme of that is learning purely for intellectual curiosity. There are 2 ends of the spectrum, actually. We're all working for organisations, and our employers need us to perform and do certain things. So we'll come on to it in a minute, but I think their responsibility in a world with the cloud is to set the objectives and the goals and provide the necessary resources, because that's how we're increasingly learning. Okay. But that's an interesting one. Maybe I've got that slightly wrong. Employee engagement.
I've seen plenty of cases where employee engagement has definitely risen as a result of it, simply because, well, if you are stuck on the periphery, you're not on the periphery anymore. You're part of the team. You're communicating. You're nodding enthusiastically. Yeah. Blogging, answering back, it's a form of communication which wasn't there before. Once it gets into the work stream, absolutely, it becomes something which you wonder, how do we get by without it?